what can the experience of Chinese who invented paper currency teach us about the dollar today? The relevance is quite significant. You see, for over 700 years, China used precious metal or bronze-based currency, silver and cash coins. And then it switched to paper. And subsequently, 5 dynasties were destroyed one after the other, in large part due to paper currency. This experience spanned 700 years and left such an indelible historical memory on the Chinese culture that the state resisted introducing paper currency again until the early 20th century. Welcome to Biocomputation with Dr. Max. Today, I want to go over the history of this Chinese invention. Chinese invented paper technology, which was forcibly transferred through the Arab empires, ultimately to the Europeans. It was another closely held secret, but this also allowed them to be the first ones to create paper currency. Was it an innovation or a curse? I wrote this paper last year and I want to go through it, but first let me introduce it with a quote from Ernest Hemingway, Notes on the Next War. He wrote, "The first panacea of a mismanaged nation is inflation of the currency. The second is war. Both bring a temporary prosperity, both bring a permanent ruin. Both are the refuge of political and economic opportunists." But let us discuss the matter of Chinese invention and history. As I mentioned, they invented paper currency perhaps 600 years before the British made it a permanent currency. Meanwhile, several hundred years before, so the Chinese invented paper currency several hundred years before the British, and they had a lot of experience before the British even started using paper. And it's a shame that it's underappreciated. So the use of paper money goes back to the Tang Dynasty. They were promissory notes similar to the way it operated in the United States, private money backed by precious metal. It was the Song Dynasty in the 10th century that made it from private paper into public currency. Now, as I'll go over this dynasty and its 4 successors for 2/3 of a millennium, had such exceptionally bad experiences that China would not forget it until it was essentially forced to go along with the crowd in the early 20th century, in the waning days of the Qing Empire. In this, I want to reference a quote by Karl Marx, who opined, I should say, I don't think it's a fair observation, he opined that religion can act as opium for the masses. The Chinese history of paper currency shows that fiat currency that's not backed by anything can be opium for the elites, as it destroyed 5 sequential dynasties. So before I go into the detail, I want to give due to interesting American scientist, a linguist, a lawyer, and a politician named John Pickering, who lived in late 18th and 19th to the middle of 19th century. And he wrote a fascinating article several years before his death. in 1844 was the article. He passed away just 2 years later. The article is entitled "The History of Paper Money in China." It's interesting that despite the fact that Mr. Pickering served as the president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, his tenure was from 1939 till his death in 18. His tenure was from 1839 till his death in 1846. Despite his acclaim, the article that I'm going to reference received scant reference. It passed virtually unnoticed, which is quite sad. I want to try to mitigate that by giving him his credit that he observed at the time that 4 dynasties out of out of 5 were brought down substantially by paper currency. So I want to give Mr. Pickering his due. He did not get the recognition at the time, nor since, unfortunately, but he made some fantastic observations, including the following regarding the Yuan Dynasty. He wrote, "The Mongols were compelled to abandon China, which they totally ruined by their chow, or paper money of value." What's interesting about it is the spelling of chow. Now it would be spelled with just CHAO. At the time, he spelled it with TCHHAO, chow. But I suppose those are the nuances of pronunciation. This is precisely what he wrote. But what's important is that the Ming Dynasty, which is the really, but what's important is that Qing Dynasty, which succeeded the Ming Dynasty, and who, as he wrote, are at the present absolute masters of China, have never attempted to issue any paper money whatsoever. Of course, this was before some rebellions that forced the Qing Dynasty to issue paper currency on an emergency basis, but they have managed to forego that type of problem because of the experience of the preceding 5, with debasement of currency that is not backed by precious metals. So let's go over this. There are 5 dynasties that I'll go over. So the Tang Dynasty invented paper currency, as I mentioned, but it was not public currency, it was private. It was the Northern Qing, the Jin, the Southern Qing, the Yuan, and the Ming that adopted paper, and all fell. In the order indicated, first the Northern Song fell, then Jin, then Southern Song, the remnants of the unified empire of the, Song. And then came the so-called Mongols, as Pickering refers to them, the Yuan Dynasty. And then the Ming Dynasty, the last long-lasting dynasty that played with paper currency and got burned. I will also go into, of course, at the end, the relevance to the modern world. The big point is the connection to gold is gone, and gold was valued at some $40 at the time when it was disconnected from the dollar by President Nixon. And as we can see, since then, it has lost some 99% of its value. Now, before going into the details, I want to make some more kind of historical references. Voltaire observed that fiat currency always eventually returns to its intrinsic value, 0. Another opponent of banks in general warned that private banks controlling currency would deprive the people of all of their property. Now, there is a author and video host Michael Maloney, who argues that fiat currency is designed to lose its value. And in fact, that's the purpose, to confiscate your wealth and transfer it to the government. Others, like Jared Kintz, describe fiat currency as a financial weapon, which continuously loses its value until it becomes worthless. That's how it's designed, not as good money, as a financial weapon. So that remains to be seen. But the history of the Chinese dynasties is quite telling. So let's go through that. So the Song Dynasty, founded in the year 960, unified China, conquering the territories that were fractured during the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, including the coverage of the Han or the Tang dynasties. It established a centralized government and had created many inventions, including paper currency, which, as I said, turned out to be opium of the elites. And it's the draw of this free resource that is the pathology that affects them. It, again, predates the European paper currency by hundreds of years. The Gutenberg Bible was first printed on the mechanical press in the year 1455. So the Jiaozi currency started, we could say the 10th century, or conservatively in the 11th century. So we're talking about 400 years predating the European experience with paper money. Now, the Song experienced their first fall under the rather communist kind of minded Chancellor Wang, who pushed some rather socialist policies, devalued the currency, leading to the conquest of this powerful and rich empire by their smaller ally, the Jurchen. Wang's reforms destroyed the Song economic prosperity, and it devalued the currency. Now, Wang's reforms so undermined the economic prosperity that they fell. The Jurchen became known as the Yuan Dynasty. What's interesting about it is that it comes from the name Great Jin, with Jin signifying gold. So they were really also into the gold backing or gold currency. But they introduced the Jiao Chao paper currency along with iron and copper coins, and perhaps in the example of Gresham's law, bad currency displaced the good. And eventually, rampant printing of money to fund their war with Mongols contributed to the collapse of the currency and the empire. And as is typical of these examples, Jin increased printing of money, resulting in hyperinflation and collapse of Jiao Chao that was driven by the need to finance wars, as I said, primarily with the Mongols. So it's this vicious cycle where conflict drives devaluation of currency, which drives more conflict and failure in that conflict and the end of the empire. So the Jin were also destroyed by the Mongols, and now we come to the southern Song Dynasty, which coexisted with the Yuan Dynasty for a while. The sovereign song remarkably experienced a similar kind of period of development and crash, with paper currency once again leading to this kind of downfall. Initially, the currency they introduced was backed by silver. Huizi was able to support booming economy in the sovereign song, but the paper eventually was overprinted and devalued to cover for deficits, causing severe inflation, making the currency almost worthless, and the sovereign song were finally crushed by the Mongols. It's interesting to quote from a paper on the subject. The sovereign song paper money did eventually depreciate immensely because of accelerating money growth. However, the component of hyperinflation that was self-generating was avoided by leaning of the wind policy, which was followed by the government. When two currencies circulated simultaneously at varying rates of exchange, the relative share of each currency in the total money supply was inherently determined. For the fiduciary currency to coexist with the stable metallic currency, by fiduciary he means fiat, the former should strive to retain its share, that is, leaning of the wind. On the other hand, a mild leaning against the wind policy would reduce the relative share of paper currency even further when the real value of paper money stock was lowered because of depreciation. The share of the paper money accordingly kept on shrinking and running away from its equilibrium. This explains why the Ming paper money was overwhelmed by the metallic currency and ultimately went out of circulation. So this was another example of Gresham's law, good money displacing the bad. Let us return to the Yuan Dynasty. After conquering the Qing Dynasty, they were undermined by the paper currency, as I quoted from Mr. Pickering. Mongols then turned their attention to the sovereign song. They had a protracted Song-Yuan war, which culminated in the defeat of the Song by the Yuan Dynasty under Kublai Khan, who completed unification of China under the Mongol rule. So this is sometimes known as the Mongol Yuan Dynasty. But they became Chinese in all of their manners. In fact, it was one of the criticisms leveled by the Mongols against the rulers. So it's a proper Chinese dynasty. The yuan was the world's first regime to use paper money as the sole medium of exchange. Again, the predecessors still had some paper, some coins circulating, but the yuan really forced currency out of circulation, transitioning from copper coins to silver and paper. Now, silver was not used for everyday transactions. That was a store value, and that has persevered in the background for hundreds of years, as I'll describe in later videos. But here, it was the paper currency that was used for all kinds of transactions. The bark of mulberry tree, as Marco Polo described it, made into currency by the will of the Khan. Now, yuan's paper currency was stable and successful for nearly half a century However, the court faced a well-known problem, escalating fiscal deficits, and so they established a fiat currency untethered to precious metals, and inflation and overissuance became unavoidable. Some researchers have carried out calculations based on issuance of the currency, and they demonstrate that the fiscal pressure was due to wars, in this case, civil wars, as the driving factor for issuance of paper money. Now, prior to their conquest of China, the Mongols predominantly used bronze cash coins of the Chinese style. And it's interesting to note that these coins had low intrinsic value, but they did not result in hyperinflation like paper currency, presumably because of physical limitations. They are more expensive to produce compared to paper money, and they had some intrinsic value. So the Yuan Dynasty fell predominantly due to internal fracture, which was brought about by weakness of their currency, but it was the other Northerners, the Manchu, the Ming Dynasty, who replaced the Mongols. They ruled from the Ming Dynasty ruled from 1368 to the middle of the 17th century, so a long run. And they also issued paper currency, but more sparingly. And that perhaps allowed them to extend the durability of their empire. Of great fame is the Great Ming Treasure Note, that is beautiful, but it was rendered virtually worthless by the 1530s already, and by 1644, the monetary crisis was dire, and it was a significant contributor to the dynasty's downfall as well. It's interesting that their form of mismanagement differed from their predecessors. They did have some overissuance and some counterfeiting, and some failure to collect taxes in paper money, which is a major source of basically foundation of value for this, which doesn't have intrinsic value, unlike sterling silver, which was smelted into silverware, for example. So the Ming also sometimes failed to collect paper currency, and that led to hyperinflation. And by the early 15th century, as I was mentioning there, paper money was nearly worthless, leading the population to adopt a de facto silver standard for monetary transactions and for state taxation. But ultimately, the collapse was not due to this runaway printing press, but to the Tears law, which is the inverse of the famous Gresham's law of bad money displacing the good. In this instance, it was the good money that displaced the bad. Basically, metallic currency displaced and outcompeted paper currencies, that led to a disbalance in the system and diminished the utility of paper currency without a true hyperinflation. Now, I will finish with the Qing Dynasty, which used bimetallic coinage system, and only occasionally during the emergencies like the Taiping Rebellion, it was forced to issue paper currency. But otherwise, it was informed by hundreds of years of experience of its predecessors who were undermined and possibly significantly destroyed by the depreciation of paper currency specifically, which Chinese invented. So during its early days, the Qing dynasty stayed away from paper money, and it was basically just private, and the government tried to not repeat the history, and transition to a metallic economy. The Qing dynasty did ultimately issue paper currency in late 19th and early 20th century, and it also led to hyperinflation. I mentioned the Taiping Rebellion, that was the middle of 19th century. There are also issues with lack of collateral, but basically issuance of paper not backed by any reserves. So the Qing dynasty was greatly, of course, undermined by their backwardness, their lack of innovation, their foreign invasions, the opium wars that they've lost, the century of humiliation, and ultimately they collapsed. But they were, throughout all of this hardship, in general, except for rebellions, staying away from paper currency. That's how telling that experience was. So I have a little table here that summarizes these dynasties, what happened to their currency, and the contribution of that to the collapse. And as you can see, for the Song, Jin, Southern Song, and Yuan Dynasty, the overprinting of paper money was a huge factor in undermining these otherwise very strong empires, many of which started with gold, like the Jin, the Yuan Dynasty. They were all about cash, but then they went to paper and collapsed. Of course, the nominal cause also was war, which led to the need to overprint. Again, the Song warred with Jin, the Jin warred with the Mongols. Southern Song also warred with the Mongols, as did the Jin, who were destroyed by them, by the Yuan Empire. That was largely destroyed by internal rebellion more than external forces, allowing Ming to come. Ming also was destroyed by internal rebellion, allowing the Manchu to come in and take over. The Qing Empire was different. They experienced external conquest, internal decay, but stayed away from paper currency. Interesting. So let me now finish with modern parallels and implications. So we discussed over 700 years with 5 Chinese dynasties sequentially falling to paper money over issuance. I've seen that kind of problem in the waning days of USSR as well. Now, the dollar is rumored to be kept within certain inflation band by the Federal Reserve, which is part of its dual mandate. Of course, when we calculate the actual inflation rate of the dollar compared to gold, we get 7.8 or even 8% per year for the last 53 or 54 years. This is a far cry from what's officially reported. And again, this is verifiable against the dollar. So we can see this loss of value and compare it to other predecessors. For example, there's a stark parallel with the Yuan Dynasty. And this table shows a very curious parallel of timelines. Now, the Yuan Dynasty established full convertibility to silver of their paper currency in 1260. And then 16 years later, it reverted to nominal convertibility. And by 1310, it had no convertibility at all, 34 years later. Now, for United States, there was a official gold standard that was established in 1900 by an act of Congress after the panic of 1907, where JP Morgan essentially rescued the economy. In 1913, they gave the power of basically creating money to the Federal Reserve. So there was the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which established full convertibility. It was over in 1933, in 1931 technically, but 1933 by, again, the Federal Reserve, which is just a few years behind the Yuan timeframe. In 1971, convertibility was suspended completely, which again is 4 years behind the Yuan, which leads to an interesting parallel between these timeframes, between the Yuan Dynasty and the United States dollar. I will also show you another calculation that I did on my own, looking at the residual value from the Bretton Woods gold price of $40 in 1944. So we were down to 1/8 of that by the year 2000, which is the beginning of this graph. It's marking years of the 21st century. And we can see a dramatic drop of the value. I did some analysis and I saw a significant quality of fit of a logarithmic fit, which is what I'm showing. But this showed a very interesting feature, that this curve actually crosses the 0% threshold in the year 2031, which is the same time frame, or the middle of the time frame that would be predicted by the Yuan Dynasty. What can we expect from this prediction? Well, I think we may experience a reform of the dollar. And as I said, this is the conclusion, that both intrinsic measurement of the residual value of the dollar measured against the gold ounce, comparing current price to what was established at Bretton Woods 1944 in New Hampshire, with the whole world basically pegging themselves to the dollar rather than to gold. And then later, of course, it became the petrodollar in the 70s. But the value relative to gold has been dropping, and there is this prediction that we are actually not just going to asymptotically approach zero. Now we have essentially only 1% of the value remaining. If the gold of 1944 was $40 and now it's about 4,000, that means we've lost some 99% of the value. And again, I expect that there will need to be a substantial reform around the year of 2031. So here's the mathematics behind that fit of the curve. Again, GDP in terms of gold rather than dollars. The Yuan Dynasty puts us at 29 to 33, and this prediction puts us at 2031. In summary, it's remarkable that the experience of Chinese who invented paper currency and had 5 successive dynasties essentially innovate themselves and get destroyed by overprinting and hyperinflation, that this experience has not been properly disseminated in the West. And now we are repeating the same experience hundreds of years later. In fact, the US dollar is already on the last legs in terms of its value retention compared to the original peg to the dollar, both when the gold standard was established or the Bretton Woods conference took place. And furthermore, we can look at the intrinsic trends of the dollar relative to gold in the last quarter of a century, in the 21st century, as well as the Yuan Dynasty predicate. And it comes to the same conclusion. In about 5 years or so, around 2031, the dollar will no longer be sustainable, perhaps, in its current form. So that's the prediction, that the dollar will not only continue to lose its value at significant pace, but will ultimately need to be reformed. So you want to be on the right side with your savings in terms of value storage. Finally, as always, res publica restituende est.